I love every kind of music, but recently I've really started to get into this thrash metal music. There's this one band out that's called Napalm Death.
What's up, everybody? I'm Finn McKenty. This is the Punk Rock MBA, and welcome back to my What Killed the Genre series. This is where I look at genres that have fallen off in terms of commercial popularity, and I try to figure out what happened. And today, we are here to talk about the 90s death metal boom. Although I've always felt more culturally connected to like punk and hardcore and all the various different subgenres of that, there was a good solid decade where I listened to more death metal than anything else. Like, if I had a penny for every blast beat or tremolo riff I've ever heard, I could easily be retired on a private island by now. Anyway, the days of the 90s death metal boom are far behind us. The days when death metal was maybe not mainstream, but kind of sort of almost mainstream. It was on MTV, it was in Hollywood movies, the bands were selling hundreds of thousands of albums. So what happened? What popped the 90s death metal bubble? Well, that is what I'm going to do my very best to explain in this video. Before I get into it really quickly, I did make a Spotify playlist for this video with some of my favorite death metal songs, so if you're into that, there's a link in the description. And I would like to thank Skillshare for sponsoring this video. Skillshare is an online learning community for creators with more than 25,000 classes in design, business, and more. Premium membership gives you unlimited access so you can join the classes and communities that are just right for you. And best of all, there's a free 2-month trial for the first 500 people who sign up using the promo link in the description for this video. So if you want to get your learn on and support the channel by showing Skillshare how awesome this audience is, hit that link, sign up, and we'll see you there. And with that out of the way, let's get into it. Part 1, the metal arms race. In order to understand why death metal had the massive impact that it did, I think it's helpful to first understand the context that it came from. I think of it kind of like everybody was in this arms race to outdo each other in terms of heaviness. First, there were the proto-metal bands like Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath, and then there was the new wave of British heavy metal bands like Judas Priest and Iron Maiden, then speed metal like Exciter, Anvil, Annihilator, and all that stuff. And as a kid who was on a quest to find the most extreme music that I could, I tried so many times to get into all the bands I just mentioned. I would see the stoner kids at school wearing their shirts, and those kids seemed so scary and edgy, so I figured the bands would be brutal, right? But then I listened to them and I was like, wait, what? This shit sucks. It's so slow and boring. Like, this isn't heavy. But it wasn't until the next phase of the arms race that I really started to get interested, and that phase was thrash metal. And when I discovered the heavier side of thrash, like Sepultura, The Accused, Forced Entry, that is when I started to really care about metal. But still, I wanted something more. I wanted something heavier, something more intense and more extreme, and I found it when I discovered death metal.
If you're wondering what these fellas are doing behind me, I don't know either.
Which brings us to part 2, the compilations that changed my world. Now, I can't tell you exactly when death metal started, and I'm not going to try to do the whole history of death metal thing. Maybe it was the song Death Metal by Possessed in 1985, or maybe it was the Death album Scream Bloody Gore in 1987. I don't know. All I can tell you is when I discovered death metal, and that was a compilation called Grindcrusher that came out on Earache Records. And when you see the lineup on this thing, you will understand why it changed my life. Morbid Angel, Repulsion, Carcass, Terrorizer, Napalm Death, Entombed, Nocturnus, Bolt Thrower, and it goes on and on. This is really the who's who of early death metal. And I listened to this thousands of times, especially Morbid Angel, Terrorizer, and Unseen Terror. And by the way, I seem to be the only person on earth who likes Unseen Terror this much. And so I bought every other death metal compilation I could get my hands on. And the next game changer for me was Roadrunner At Death's Door compilation, which had Deicide, Malevolent Creation, and Obituary, among others. And then the final piece of the puzzle was a couple years later, Relapse's incredible Corporate Death compilation, which had Mortician, Incantation, Macabre, Suffocation, Dismember, tons and tons of cool bands. And once I got these comps, I was hooked. I needed more death metal in my life. And I wasn't the only one who got hooked on death metal back then. I didn't realize it at the time, since I lived in a small suburb of Seattle where basically nobody else I knew liked death metal or really even knew what it was. But this was the beginning of the 90s death metal explosion.
Now, whether death metal finds acceptance or goes the way of punk music, just a passing fad, remains to be seen.
Which brings me to part 3, the global explosion. What I later found out from reading interviews and metal magazines is that the death metal scene was blossoming all over the world. And just like hardcore, back then everything was a lot more regional than it is now. So rather than one big global scene, it was more like a collection of smaller scenes centered around a particular city or area that all kind of had their own sound and vibe. And I wasn't really directly a part of any of them like I was with hardcore, but from what I saw, these were the big ones.
Well, I guess it started with Napalm Death. They were pretty much one of the first bands in the world to play the way they do, and like they influenced most of the other bands on the label, as well as all the grindcore bands in the world, really.
First, the Earache Records UK kind of scene. Although they did have bands from all over the world, Earache was based in the UK and its roots were in that country's crust and grindcore scene that emerged in the 80s around bands like Napalm Death, Heresy, Concrete Socks, and Carcass, among many others. And like I said earlier, Earache was my personal gateway into death metal, and I credit them with putting death metal on the map in general. And in hindsight, I think what I liked about their version of it and about that scene was that although people thought of bands like Carcass and Napalm Death as death metal and Earache as a death metal label, they were really more a product of the punk scene, so I vibed with them more than I did the other bands that were actual metal bands. And as an example of that punky, noisy Earache kind of sound, and next, the Florida scene. Weirdly, the city of Tampa, Florida was kind of the global epicenter of the death metal scene. If you were into death metal, you wanted to move to Tampa.
Whenever anybody tells me they're thinking about moving their band down to Florida, I say, hey, it couldn't hurt.
And it sounds weird, but I can kind of understand why, because it really was home to a ton of the most important bands in the genre at the time. Death, Morbid Angel, Obituary, and Deicide being the biggest names, as well as home to More Sound Studios, which is where a massive chunk of 90s death metal was recorded. The guy who did most of that stuff was a producer named Scott Burns, who totally redefined how metal recordings could sound. He was the first person to really capture metal in the kind of clean, precise way that we think about it now. And down in Miami, they had their own little scene, which is pretty cool, including two of the most innovative death metal bands of that whole era that basically invented progressive death metal, which is Cynic and Atheist. And here's an example of the Florida sound, which you'll notice is a lot cleaner and more technical than the Earache sound. And the New York scene. I talked about this at length in my video about Slam, so if you want to hear more detail about this, check that video out. But once I discovered the New York death metal variant, it quickly became my favorite version of death metal because it was just all about, it's really similar to hardcore in a lot of ways. It was all about those like chunky, chromatic slam riffs that are guaranteed to get the pit started. This scene was centered around Long Island, New York, with the main bands being Suffocation, Internal Bleeding, and Pyrexia, but there were also some bands doing it upstate like Skinless, Malevolent, and tons of other great smaller bands. And here's an example of the New York death metal sound and what I mean by a slam riff. And lastly, the Scandinavian scene. You're probably familiar with this one, the Swedish, Danish, and Norwegian death metal scenes, which have become so famous since the 90s. If you're watching this, you probably know all the big names like Entombed, At the Gates, Dismember, and my personal favorites of the Scandinavian scene, Unleashed. I'm actually not a huge fan of this style, but I totally get the appeal. I totally get why it's stuck around for so long, because these guys combined a little bit of melody with a lot of catchy songwriting and kind of the energy of punk and hardcore into something that really did have staying power. As an example of that classic Scandinavian death metal sound, honestly, it was a really cool time. There was just so much creative energy in the air. It all felt really new and fresh. And even though, like I said, I wasn't directly involved in the death metal scene like I was with the hardcore scene, it was super inspiring to see all this stuff happening simultaneously. All these regional scenes doing their own thing, but all of it kind of collectively moving the genre of death metal forward. And it turns out I was not the only one paying attention. What had started as a very small underground scene was getting much bigger than I think anyone ever thought it would.
Well, now Tampa is spawning a new breed of music. Their music is called death metal. These bands have a message, and what they're saying isn't pretty.
Which brings me to part 4, the peak. And if I had to pick one single point in time, I would say 1994 was the very peak of death metal. And I say that because that's the year that the genre got the most mainstream attention, and there's two things in particular that I remember as watershed moments. The first was probably extreme metal's biggest moment ever in this mainstream spotlight, even to this day, which was Cannibal Corpse's legendary appearance in the Jim Carrey movie Ace Ventura Pet Detective, which was a huge mainstream movie that everybody in my 8th grade class saw. And here's the scene.
1, 2, 3, 4!
The second was Beavis and Butthead. And for anyone who isn't familiar, that was a show on MTV in the 90s created by the guy who would go on to do King of the Hill, where basically these two characters, these two like teenage stoners, would make fun of music videos. It was super popular, and in 1994 they did this segment where they made fun of Morbid Angel's God of Emptiness. And they played this all the time.
This is where it starts to get really stupid. Bow to me faithfully. Bow to me.
And they also did this segment on a death video, although I don't remember seeing that one as frequently.
And a small order of pride to go. That was pretty good, Beavis. You suck almost as much as this dude.
And these Beavis and Butthead segments were actually a pretty big deal for death metal because this show was on MTV constantly during the prime years of the channel, which meant that millions and millions of people were actually getting introduced to death metal from this show. It's also the year that Cannibal Corpse and Morbid Angel released their best-selling albums, which would be The Bleeding and Covenant, respectively. And according to SoundScan data, Covenant is actually the best-selling death metal album of all time, I think like 150,000 copies. So if that's true, that would make 1994 the actual literal peak of the genre in the commercial sense. That said, it's not like the genre ran out of steam overnight or anything and just suddenly disappeared. In fact, it's actually quite the contrary. At the Gates' Slaughter of the Soul album came out in 1995, which is arguably the most important death metal album of its generation. Cannibal Corpse, Morbid Angel, and Deicide all put out solid albums in 95 and 96, and there are dozens and dozens of fantastic albums from smaller bands that came out in the later half of the 90s as well. A few of my personal favorites being Cryptopsy, Deeds of Flesh, Oppressor, and Broken Hope. But still, it started to become pretty clear that the genre was beginning to run out of steam.
So let's lighten the mood here, a little madness on the BBC. Was that it?
Yep, basically.
How come songs that are so short?
Part 5, The Decline. So what happened? Well, the first issue is that a lot of the big bands started to stumble a little bit. David Vincent left Morbid Angel, and it really just wasn't the same without him. Chris Barnes left Cannibal Corpse, and although in their case Corpse Grinder ended up being just as good of a frontman as Barnes, it was a little bit of a stumbling block for the band. Deicide started to really phone it in musically, and Obituary broke up in 97. So basically those were the 4 biggest bands all kind of stumbling a little bit at the same time. And second, there was a massive glut of honestly just really boring generic bands that brought absolutely nothing new to the table. Just dozens and dozens and dozens of bands that looked and sounded like less inspired versions of Cannibal Corpse, Suffocation, or Morbid Angel. And there were definitely some really good bands that came out in that era too, like Origin, but it was hard to find those bands because they just kind of got lost in the endless stream of boring generic albums that were coming out every week. It's just really hard to care about new death metal. And third, the real nail in the coffin. A new challenger appeared that started to steal the spotlight, and that challenger was black metal. I think black metal took off because it had everything that death metal at that time lacked. The most obvious of those things was an image. Death metal, on the other hand, well, it might have been scary and mysterious in 1989, but by the mid-90s it was just kind of guys in cargo shorts playing knockoff Cannibal Corpse riff, which is sort of cool in a way in that it's very like authentic and down to earth, but the problem is there was nothing intriguing about it. There was no like sense of mystery like there was when I first heard about Morbid Angel back in the day. It was maybe a little bit too down to earth. Black metal, on the other hand, was all about drama and theater, right? I remember hearing about all the Euronymous murder stuff, all the stuff from Lords of Chaos, and seeing pictures of those guys in their corpse paint, their armor, and just being so intrigued. It was so dark and mysterious. There were so many of these larger-than-life personalities. You just like really couldn't not pay attention to it. And musically, as you've heard a lot of these black metal guys talk about, it was deliberately the opposite of all the things death metal had become in their eyes and in mine as well. Death death metal was overproduced, sterile, and predictable by the mid-90s. But black metal, on the other hand, was raw, chaotic, and experimental. Bands like Emperor and Burzum were trying all kinds of crazy experimental things that felt incredibly new and fresh, and even if some of their experiments didn't turn out the best, such as Burzum's generic 16-bit JRPG music phase, it was definitely different. I can't speak for everybody, but I know the first time I heard In the Nightside Eclipse, I was just completely blown away. I'd never heard anything like it, and I didn't really know how to process it. It was so just loose and discordant and odd compared to all the straightforward death metal that I've been listening to for years. Just to give you a frame of reference, compare this to this. And I never really liked black metal. In fact, I kind of hated it, and for the most part, I still don't like it. But even I had to admit that standard death metal bands like Incantation or Immolation felt kind of dated compared to this stuff. It just felt like they belonged to a previous generation. Like the big, slow dinosaurs lumbering around while the little, nimble mammals ran circles around them. And then there were also bands like Immortal or Abruptum that weren't really doing anything musically revolutionary, but definitely took things to a new level of aggression. Like Battles in the North is just so relentlessly blasting and intense, and kind of reminds me of the feeling I had when I first heard Hammer Smash Face, and I was just like, holy fuck, how can music even be this aggressive? But most of all, black metal was entertaining. Look, people don't like to hear this, especially in metal, but the music business isn't just about the music. It's the entertainment business. And image has always been a huge component of metal, since the days of Ozzy biting the heads off of bats and Slayer's hilarious photos from Haunting the Chapel, to later on bands like Slipknot and Ghost. Metal fans want to tell themselves that the music is everything, but that's just not true. The image matters a lot in metal. That's just a fact. And think about it this way. What's more marketable? On the death metal side of things, a bunch of guys named Mark and John standing on stage in cargo shorts and work boots? Or on the black metal side of things, guys in corpse paint holding swords with cool names like Count Grishnak and these insane backstories involving satanic cults and murdering their best friends? It's not even a contest. Black metal is a marketer's dream come true. Death metal had that mystery and danger in the beginning with bands like Deicide and Morbid Angel, with Glenn Benton doing the whole burning of cross in his forehead thing. But the mystery was gone from death metal by the mid-90s, and that left the door wide open for black metal. It started kind of bubbling up in 94, 95, 96, and then in 97, 98, that is when black metal had really taken over. And the two bands that I think really took the spotlight away from death metal were Cradle of Filth and Emperor. By 1998 or so, the pages of Metal Maniacs, Pit, and all the other metal magazines were dominated by black metal. There were, of course, still death metal bands doing their thing, but black metal was the hot new kid on the block. The death metal boom was clearly over.
Beyond the headbanging, away from the fury of the mosh pit, there's evil lurking inside the door of this personal storage unit. Rising death metal band Nocturnus.
Which brings us to part number 6, the legacy. Now, the death metal boom may be over, and you may not see Morbid Angel videos on MTV anymore, but make no mistake about it, death metal made a very big, lasting impact not just on metal and underground music, but on pop culture in general. In fact, it's a huge influence on some of the most mainstream pop culture phenomena of this decade. On the musical side of things, its influence is very much felt on pretty much every subgenre of heavy music, even genres that are pretty far removed from death metal. For example, the growling vocals in a pop-punk band like A Day to Remember, in my opinion, can be directly traced back to death metal. And obviously there would be no deathcore without death metal, there would be no Slipknot without death metal, and a good chunk of modern hardcore bands like Nails, Zabalba, or Harm's Way are basically just old-school death metal with slightly different vocals. I mean, listen to this. It could easily be something that came out on Earache in 93, right? And as I've talked about in a lot of my other videos, death metal is also a huge influence on this generation of rap. The most obvious examples being artists like Ghostmane and Bones, who grew up as metal kids before they started rapping, and also all the so-called trap metal rappers like Scarlord and Zillakami. As a couple examples of what I'm talking about, the Bones video where he's wearing a Burzum shirt, and yes, I'm aware they're not death metal, but you get my point. And then the trap metal thing. Again, you can very clearly hear the connection to death metal.
My fucking name, extra mouth, you don't know me.
I'm sure Glenn Benton did not see this coming, but it's very real. Death metal is honestly a big part of what rap is today. And what's maybe the most wild thing to me is the whole old school death metal trend that's been happening in fashion for the past couple years. The most obvious example, I think, is a brand called Vetements, which was one of the most influential and groundbreaking brands in this generation of high fashion. And the whole brand kind of revolved around this like old school death metal aesthetic. For example, check out this logo or this Cradle of Filth shirt that he quote unquote borrowed. And by the way, that hoodie that I showed you is like $900. And the guy who started the brand is now the creative director for the high fashion brand Balenciaga, which means that death metal has officially become cool. It's officially become highbrow in a weird kind of way. I could go on and on listing more examples of that, but really none of them would beat the most ridiculous and amazing example of this, which is Kim Kardashian wearing a Morbid Angel shirt. What a time to be alive. Now, does she like Morbid Angel? Of course not. I'm sure she has no idea who they are. But that doesn't matter. What matters is the fact that their shirt ended up on probably the most famous person on the planet tells you that they and the rest of their peers in the 90s death metal scene, they did something pretty fucking groundbreaking. They did something that made a real mark on the world of music and culture. And if you want to do something that makes a mark on the world of music and culture, then I would suggest you level up your marketing and design skills. And you know a great place to do that? Skillshare. Skillshare is also super affordable. An annual subscription is less than $10 a month. And the first 500 of my subscribers to use the link in the description will get a free 2-month trial. I know a lot of you guys have questions about social media. I would check out Sophia Chang's Instagram course. Gary Vaynerchuk also has a great one. If any of you are interested in design, whether that's lettering or typography, anything like that, I would highly suggest you check out Jessica Hish's logo design masterclass. She's one of the best in the game when it comes to lettering. And maybe my favorite on Skillshare, Aaron Draplin. He's one of the very best type designers of the past, 20, 30 years. He's got a lot to teach. Very cool, fun guy who, by the way, likes Poison Idea. So if you're interested in typography, if you like Poison Idea, check out Aaron Draplin's class. Again, first 500 people to sign up using the link in the description in this video will get a free 2-month trial. Alright guys, there you go. That is my 2 cents on what popped the 90s death metal bubble. I would love to hear what you guys think in the comments. Were you around back then? Did you see the 90s death metal boom? What was your favorite flavor of it? Did you like the Earache version, the Relapse version, the Roadrunner version, the Swedish version? Let me know in the comments what your favorite flavor of death metal is, and also let me know what you think popped the bubble. And again, if you want to hear some of my favorite death metal songs, including almost all the bands I talked about in this video and tons more, there is a Spotify playlist for this video. There's a link in the description. And as always, if you liked this video or any of my other videos, I would love it if you give me a follow on Instagram. There's also a link to that in the description. And with that, I'm going to sign off for now, but I will see you next time.